1985, Vampire Hunter D was released, a Japanese animated film that was based on a character who'd appeared in this long-running series of light novels, which, from my basic understanding, I think are sort of like Japanese pulp novels. Anyway, whilst the 85 film did well for itself, most fans are generally in agreement that the follow-up film, 2000's Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust, is by far the superior representation of the character on screen, a bigger, bloodier and more elegantly rendered crack at putting the ice-cool anti-hero from the novels on screen, with far more detailed animation and a much more faithfully dark and broody tone. It was directed by Yoshiaki Kawajiri, who was the guy responsible for groundbreaking adult anime films like Wicked City and Ninja Scroll. Now, the character of Vampire Hunter D himself is incredibly cool. He's this half-human, half-vampire bounty hunter who's described as being at war with himself, feared by all, tortured and alone, and in many ways he's the ultimate kind of mythic lone gunslinger character. A brooding badass who mixes in elements of Batman, Dracula, Zorro, the Man with No Name, and a wandering samurai. He's noble and gnomic in equal measure, deeply enigmatic and all but defined by his look and his physicality, his eyes almost always lost under the shadow of his hat, his androgynous face drained of all emotion and colour. In short, he's the perfect character to be presented by the medium of animation, where he can really exaggerate his archetypal nature and his epically powerful and imposing stature. Now, the story of the film itself is very simple, but it's not without its own twists on some familiar tropes and ideas. It's basically a kind of rescue the captured princess fantasy quest type story, where Vampire Hunter D treks along this fantastic, evocatively rendered post-apocalyptic landscape, fighting all manner of fantastic foes and encountering potential rivals and possible allies along the way, until eventually he gets to the baddie's castle, where he has to rescue the damsel in distress from the evil vampire lord Count Meyer Link. Now, what's good about having a very simple and familiar story is that it opens up the film itself to let it become basically a showcase for stitching together an array of incredibly imaginative and outlandish set pieces. See, what I love so much about animation, and definitely Japanese anime in particular, although I must admit I'm no great scholar of the genre even though I tend to really like what I do watch, is that animation really opens up the possibilities of what you can do and what stories you can tell. Vampire Hunter D throws in tons of incredibly memorable adversaries, strange, reality-bending monsters with their own unique codes of logic and terrifying powers, and you can see how much thought and imagination has gone into all of the designs, into making everything that you see on screen as cool and unique as possible. This is not your gritty, grubby, used reality fantasy. It's a world of beautiful gothic architecture and shifting shadows, sprawling landscapes and epic, incredible images. Because if animation is the stringing together of pictures in order to create the illusion of movement, then the pictures in Vampire Hunter D are all absolute works of art in themselves. It's easily one of the most beautiful looking films that I've seen in a long time, a really dazzlingly inventive and stylish showcase for some insanely talented creatives to just totally cut loose and really go to town on bringing this fantastic world to life. In fact, it's really a lot more of a mood piece than it is a strictly narrative story, although there are plenty of interesting character beats along the way. However, there are some intriguing ideas that draw from that pool of kind of doom-laden gothic romance, where it's all about loneliness and embracing the darkness, and characters brooding about being in pain and having to deal with their own raging inner turmoils. That stuff's all fascinating in a kind of gloomy, emo-ish way, especially when it's delivered with such convincingly rendered gorgeous scenes of glassy-eyed melodrama, and it's in those scenes where it feels like Bloodlust is at its most affecting. Just the whole intense seriousness of Vampire Hunter D overall is something that I just absolutely love about it. The drama and situations are all so incredibly heightened and extreme and fantastic, but yet it never tries to prick its own self-seriousness or to be ironic about it, which is great. In general, I really love Bloodlust, just because it displays so much scope and grandeur, and because its characters are always posing dramatically, or doing impossible things, or struggling to deal with their own self-destructive emotions. It's an absolute sensory feast of a film with a nice gloomy gothic flavour. Now, that's not to say that I don't have certain problems with it. For one, I do think that basic quest type structure is lazy and just fundamentally uninteresting. It's just a way of trotting from one generic set piece to the next until you finally decide that it's time to get to the final showdown. Even though the journey in this film is stunning and does take you to some awe-inspiring places, I just find that quests are the laziest possible way of moving characters through a story, just this series of episodic bits that never amount to much in themselves. Rather than actually setting up Meyer Link, the main villain, and his turmoils, we just have our leads bouncing about from one crazy baddie to the next, whilst Link is largely off-screen, and that means that his own major character beats seem like they come out of nowhere as a result of having all the scenes compressed into the latter half of the film. Secondly, I think that even though the look of the film is outstanding, I think it suffers from having a very tinny and underwhelming little soundtrack that never really swells to the great mythical heights that I think something like this demands. There's tons of scenes where something really cool or dramatic happens, and you need some big, epic bit of music to counterpoint it. And instead, you just get this kind of piddly, clashy, stabby, not particularly exciting filler. Sound is always incredibly important when it comes to animation, because you're creating the illusion of an entire cinematic world, but I think that the music in this film just lacks any strong sense of identity, and it never even works just to bring up the power of what's on screen at any given moment. And I guess the last big problem I've got is this. When you say, oh, this film looks really great, that it's this kind of dazzling parade of really cool, unique images, is that just a roundabout way of saying that it's really just all style and no substance? Is it actually a good film all around, or is it just some really cool looking whiz-bang with nothing much going on under the surface? I mean, to some extent, maybe you can say that, yeah, there is a certain hollowness to it. The story is slight, definitely. The characters aren't really anything more than just a series of static attributes. More often than not, you're left to figure out their personalities and who they are by the way that they look, by their costumes, a lot of which have got that kind of very 90s extreme kind of Image comics design to them, all headbands and mohawks and big shoulders and ridiculously massive weapons. But for me, what keeps it interesting isn't so much the actual mechanics of the plot or what's at stake, as it is simply the journey itself and getting a chance to just explore this unique fantasy world in all its majesty. Because the thing is, Vampire Hunter D mixes in a lot of different genres, sci-fi, horror, western, action and so on. But the direction the story goes in is basically a fantasy quest, but in this post-apocalyptic landscape. So, to me, the bits where it's just mercenaries with big guns shooting stuff, or where it's kind of doing mock Old West stuff, that's less interesting to me, just because a lot of that sort of stuff feels very generic, like it could be anything. The action is definitely stylishly directed for sure, but is often at the expense of any meaningful character development. The really good stuff, the bits when Bloodlust comes alive the most, is when it's dealing with the gothic horror elements. The dark romance at the heart of this film, the beautiful princess in love with a vampire, is an interesting inversion of the way that those stories are usually told, and it's in those scenes that there's something approaching a genuine emotional core. Meyer Link is a fascinating character, noble and charismatic and voiced to perfection by the fantastic John Rafter Lee, who is the voice of the brilliant Trevor Goodchild in the Peter Chung Eon Flux series, and we get a chance to see that in a fairly black and white goodies against monsters story, that there's more to Link than just being this cartoony arch nemesis. And it's that grey area, that little unexpected sidestep, that shows that Bloodlust is both extremely genre literate, it's aware of the conventions of the gothic romance enough to play about with them in interesting ways, but also that it's taking a more sophisticated adult approach to its themes. Because the vampire romance is, to me, just ultimately more interesting and more compelling than all the various action scenes, just because it's in those moments that we get something more than just shallow posing, where you actually get a chance to feel that there's some genuine emotion being poured into the characters instead of just surface flashiness. Equally, it's Dee's own brief moments of vulnerability when he's at his most interesting as a character, even though the nature of this kind of story, which is an IP centred around the continuing adventures of its lead character, is that he ultimately has to remain an unkillable badass who never shows any emotion or progresses as a character. So I think all in all, there is an awful lot to really like in Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust. I think it's a cool mixing of different genres to create a world that's unique and vivid, realised with a great deal of energy and imagination, and a beautiful eye for a striking landscape or a gorgeously detailed architecture. Unfortunately, in spite of that, I think its characters are less convincing. Ironically, these two-dimensional beings that are spruced up with catchy gimmicks and funky outfits, but who rarely ever manage to be much more than just sketches, despite some nice voice acting. There's absolutely images in Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust that will really stick with you, but for me, it's always the moments of emotion and real drama that stick with you the most, and even the inventive and lively action scenes rarely ever seem to have much in the way of stakes. Because I think the real joy of anime, from what I've seen and enjoyed, isn't just that it looks cool, and because it's wild and crazy and because there's so much imagination gone into it. It's about heightened emotions and drama, and getting swept up in the sheer energy of the characters' passions and struggles. I didn't feel enough of that here, and that's something that I just can't quite get past. So for that reason, I'm going to rate Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust at a 7.5 out of 10. I really enjoyed it. It's one of the most sumptuous and painterly animated films I've ever seen. Like the world, like the characters, and I loved all the cool ideas that were bouncing about and the amount of imagination that's gone into it all. I just needed something more from it. I needed to care more about these characters. I think I'd have liked less action and people with massive guns just blowing stuff up, and more of Vampire Hunter D just being cool and quietly imposing, and more emphasis on the gothic horror aspects, with much more of that kind of yin and yang conflict between Dee and Meyer Link, who I can't help but feel just gets underused as a character. But in spite of that, I'd still really recommend this one, just because it goes to places that most normal horror films don't, and because it's got more pure raw imagination and cool inventive ideas in it than pretty much a dozen bog-standard American horror films have got, and that cannot be understated.